From Interfaith Alliance, this is State of Belief Radio. I'm your host, Reverend Welton Gaddy. It's been a year of appeals to voters' values, often in the blatant language of religion, whether questioning Barack Obama's Christianity or rejecting, then embracing Mitt Romney's Mormonism, whether endorsing candidates in some churches during the so-called Pulpit Freedom Sunday or organizing pastors on both sides of the marriage equality issue. But even beyond religion, there are few issues in this year's election that don't connect with the personal values and ethics of voters in one way or another. That's one reason why it is so valuable to have, just days before the election, a comprehensive new look at the self-professed values of our fellow Americans. The Public Religion Research Institute's annual American Values Survey. It's hot off the press, and I'm very pleased to have PRRI's founding CEO, Dr. Robert P. Jones, joining me in the studio to talk about it. You know that when he's here, we're going to learn something. Robbie, welcome back to State of Belief Radio.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
For months now, we've been inundated with horse race surveys on a daily basis. Who's ahead in the presidential contest? Basically, I guess that's it. And then very little context beyond speculation from cable TV talking heads. You go so much deeper than that with your research, and you probably elicit some answers that may predict voter behavior better than they're just saying whom they intend to vote for. For anyone who's new to this values survey, would you take a moment and just briefly describe the premise of why you do it?
Sure. Well, every year we try to go into the field with a big survey on religion, values, and public policy, public life, trying to get it really at the heart of what Americans are thinking and what kind of values and religious beliefs and how they're influencing their views on public policy. So in election years, obviously, we focus on things that are very, near to the campaigns and at the lead of the disagreements, as we've done this year. But we also try to really understand things like, the different coalitions that are making up each of the candidates or each of the parties' bases and how that differs and what effect that makes on how the campaigns deal with things like religion and cultural values.
Yeah. Well, I know the American Values Survey is just hot off the press. What are the headlines this time?
I think a couple of things. One is the continued diversity of the American religious landscape, and that it's really shifting quite dramatically, and that's not often noticed, I think, because sometimes we look at the vote numbers and they don't seem to sort of on the surface be moving a whole lot. But just one little tidbit here. But more than a third of Americans have actually switched their religious affiliation from the religion which they were raised. So that means there's quite a bit of churn in the American religious landscape underneath the surface of what's sometimes seems to be kind of a calm waters. And I think the other thing we highlight in the report is really the real diversity of both Catholics and try to dispel, I think, some notions of like the Catholic vote and really argue that there's really not a Catholic vote. And then the other thing we try to provide a new lens on is understanding this large and growing group of religiously unaffiliated Americans, which have been known by various, President Obama called them non-believers. The media's taken to calling them the nuns. That's right. The N-O-N-E-S's, not the N-U-N-S's. Right. But I think they're little understood. And so we tried to cast some additional light on kind of what role they're playing in American politics.
I actually don't know whether, and I'm going to ask this question because the question I was going to ask at this point you've already answered, but I'm curious the trends that you talk about, the changing of religious affiliation, whether it's within or changing to one of the nuns. Do you have an insight as to whether the changes are values-driven, or are they just social, cultural, geographical changes?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the unaffiliated, we definitely see some generational marks here. There's something going on that's different than it was in the past. So we've always seen that younger people are less religiously affiliated than older people. But we can actually go back in the data and look at comparable points in time, decade by decade, the under 30 crowd, how unaffiliated they were. And this cohort is much more unaffiliated than comparable generations were in the past at this same age in their life cycle. It's very interesting to see. So nearly a third of those under the age of 30, for example, count themselves among the religiously unaffiliated, whereas in the general populations it's 19%. So considerably higher in the general population. Now, and since the 1990s, the number of religiously unaffiliated Americans has nearly tripled. So it was down in single digits, around 5, 6, 7%. It's now 19% of the general population.
Yeah. Well, my understanding is, and I'm asking this for either verification or some elaboration of your thoughts on it, but isn't it true that the people unaffiliated now, that almost 20% of the people, tend to lean more toward the Democratic point of view than toward the Republican point of view? Yeah. And is that being taken into consideration during this election cycle?
Yeah. Well, it's not a mistake that President Obama was the first president to give a shout out to the non-believers, which is the term he used, as he was president, and he was the first president, to my knowledge, to do that in his 2009 inaugural address. And when you look at his coalition, fully 23% of Obama's kind of among likely voters are religiously unaffiliated Americans. It's a big part of Obama's base. Compare that to less than 1 in 10 of Romney's base being unaffiliated. So there's clearly some partisan differences. So you're right. They do lean heavily toward Democratic candidates and are supporting Obama very strongly. One very interesting thing historically is that we now have sort of in each partisan camp, if you will, fairly equally sized groups. So there's about 1 in 5 Americans are evangelical Christian, who about 3/4 support Romney and Republican presidential candidates. But now we've had this other group that's kind of serving as an interesting counterbalance that's about 1 in 5 Americans and is supporting Democratic candidates at about the same levels as white evangelicals are. So we have a kind of new factor on the scene that we really haven't had in decades past.
I do think it's important to point out in that regard that it's not as simplistic as to say, well, these are just the religious versus the non-religious.
Right.
But because everything I read about the nuns say that many of these people have deep, solid beliefs and even practice religious rituals.
Yeah. One of the things that I think was most fascinating, and is something new actually that we've contributed to the debate, was being able to look underneath this group and see the subdivisions within this group. So we've known for a long time that there was a group, makes up about 4 in 10 of the unaffiliated or atheists or agnostics. Now that's a group that's been around for a long time. We kind of have a conceptual idea of who they are. But the rest of this group, which makes up most of them, we were kind of unsure who they are. And in this last survey, we found out that there's actually 2 other distinct groups in there that we've called secular Americans. They are kind of, they describe themselves as non-religious or secular people. But there's this new group that we really identified for the first time that we've called unattached believers that are counted among the unaffiliated, and they're a big part of why this group has grown. But if you look at them, nearly 7 in 10 of them have a personal view of God. They think God is a person with whom one can have a relationship. A majority of them go to religious services at least a few times a year. They're not, the kind of, religious rejectionist at all. They just have drifted away from formal religious affiliation.
And there's several common values that the secular and those religious people hold together, right?
Right, that's right. Yeah.
Robbie, when you look at the findings from this year's American Values Survey, you've already mentioned something that President Obama paid attention to. What should both presidential candidates be paying attention to?
Yeah. Well, I certainly think that one of the things that both parties should remember is that, by and large, most Americans are religious in some way, care about religion in the election. What's interesting, though, is that the two presidential candidates have very different jobs in terms of talking to their base of supporters. So if we look at Romney's base, it's 3/4. That is 75% of them are white Christians, right? So it's a very homogeneous group that he has to talk to. Look at Obama's base, it's less than 4 in 10 are white Christians, right? The rest are minority Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, the non-religious, and the unaffiliated. So he's got a much more heterogeneous group to communicate to. This tells you a little bit about, I think, why some of the campaigns run the way they do, is that Romney, and in that group of Romney supporters, nearly 4 in 10 of Romney's are white evangelical Protestants. So Romney has as many white evangelical Protestants as Obama has all white Christians put together. So it's a very different set of groups that both the candidates have to communicate with.
Mm-hmm. Did you see anything else that you think might contribute to the way this year's election plays out?
Yeah. Well, one other thing I'll bring up that we talked about, there's been a lot of ink spilled about contraception,
Yes.
for example, in this debate and women's issues. And we asked specifically, because we've been polling on this all year, so back in March, we found that solid majority of Americans actually supported the administration's position that employers should have to cover contraception for their employees at no cost. That this is a requirement. The Obama administration has tweaked the rules a little bit in response to some criticism, but the bishops have not been satisfied with those things and launched a Fortnight for Freedom campaign, as your listeners know. So we asked basically the same question again to see if there had been any movement at all, and there has been none, no movement. So we still have a solid majority of Americans saying that employers, even religiously affiliated employers, should have to supply contraception coverage for their employees at no cost. We even went the extra step of inserting into the question, even if they have religious objections. So we split our sample in half. Half the sample got a question without that explicit marker, and then the other half got this extra phrase that said, even if they have religious objections. It made absolutely no difference in the results. And part of that is, I think, that people already had that in mind, that this was part of the objection was a religious objection. So I think we can say with some, definiteness here that, and by the way, this is true of Catholics overall. Even a solid majority of Catholics overall supported the Obama administration's position. The exception to that is white Catholics who are basically evenly divided on the question.
Now, this is one of those frustrating chicken or the egg questions, but I want to try asking it anyway. With so much focus on values messaging during this endless political season, do you think that all of the appeals to the voters in values terms are really just attempts to follow their lead on what matters most to them, or could your survey actually be showing some changes that are a reaction to all of the rhetoric on values? Well,
the term values has taken on a very funny balance in American politics ever since 2004, right? For odd, accidents of history, that term has come to be associated with just a very narrow set of issues, abortion or same-sex marriage. And I think what we're seeing, now is that that there's kind of a broader attempt to, we're seeing things like, talk about the budget as a moral document, talk about protecting the poor even while we're doing cuts to reduce the deficit. These are also values, and we see this kind of showing up in things like solid support, for example, of raising taxes on those who make over $250,000 a year. That kind of cuts across the board, across party lines, and cuts across generational lines, all kinds of lines. Basically, a fair amount of consensus on this question, and that's about a kind of value, right? People who have more means ought to be able to contribute more especially when we're in an economic crisis. So I think there's a kind of bigger set of values, and I think values has escaped, I think, a cage that was never big enough to hold it anyway.
Right.
In 2004, and become a much broader kind of theme. And the economy obviously is right at the top. I mean, I've sort of commented on this that in the foreign policy debate, we saw 40% of the foreign policy debate ended up being about domestic economic issues, and this is reasons why.
Well, I think the very surveys that you do have helped push the breadth of definition of values, and that's been a helpful thing in itself. When you and your staff sit down and look at your findings, are you able to suggest that there are going to be some trends coming from what you found?
Well, one of the things that's remarkable, I think, is this good segue from the last question, is the decoupling of same-sex marriage and abortion, right? Mm-hmm. In 2004, we couldn't really hear one of those things without hearing the other in the same sentence, and, kind of got fueled all this talk about a culture war. And, what we've seen, and I think we'll continue to see, is mostly because of a generational support, but also because of older people changing their minds. I mean, the real break now is all the way up to into the 40s, and so you get generational support all the way up into people into their 40s. Majority support for allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry. It's really mostly older generations that have a different view on that, and the difference between the generations are really stark on this question. It seems to me pretty clear that these trends will continue. I don't see any evidence that they won't. On abortion, we see pretty flat attitudes. We don't see the kind of movement among the generations. So I think one trend we'll see is these two issues continuing to drift apart, with, I think, the debate mostly subsiding, actually, mm-hmm. on same-sex marriage, and the debate on abortion probably here for the long term.
Yeah. Robbie, you do this so often. There's one question I almost always ask you, and the reason I ask it is because you do this so often that I'm guessing you usually have in mind kind of what a survey is likely to show, what the polling data. Were there any surprises in this one?
Well, one we haven't talked about, I think, is we had a new question that we were trying to sort out. There's been this fight inside the Catholic Church between the bishops on the one hand and the nuns on the other, and where the bishops have criticized the nuns for not placing enough emphasis on things like abortion, same-sex marriage, and the nuns have sort of retrenched and sort of returned the favor in some cases and said, well, there's been too much emphasis on this. And so we tried to craft a very careful question to ask of Catholics about what priorities they would like to see from their church in its public policy pronouncements. So regardless of what their personal views were, what did they want to see from their from public policy pronouncements from the Catholic Church? And one very interesting thing that we found is that by a factor of 2 to 1, 60% to 31%, American Catholics say that they'd like to see an emphasis on social justice and an obligation to care for the poor, even if it means spending less time on issues like abortion and right to life. 31% say the opposite. So that we actually didn't know how that would turn out because it hasn't been asked before, but it's a very interesting finding.
This is a little bit more a finessed question, I guess, but what is the group in America that after this survey this year you would keep an eye on as possibly a change maker for this survey next year?
Yeah. Well, there's two groups in the middle that, if you're going to talk about religious swing groups, it would be Catholics and white mainline Protestants. For a long time, these two groups have been converging toward the middle. Historically, white mainline Protestants were a solid Republican constituency that had been moving more and more into the center, and the opposite was true of Catholics. They were a solid Democratic constituency that's been moving more and more into the center. And now you can really see, especially among Catholics, the candidates are just divided. There's divided between the candidates. But I think particularly Catholics, because they're so complex, there's this ethnic break between white Catholics and Hispanic Catholics, where Hispanic Catholics are supporting Obama very, very strongly, 7 and 10 supporting Obama, and white Catholics leaning slightly toward Romney. So there's kind of tension between these two ethnic groups among Catholics. Mm-hmm. But then then there's this other kind of divide between kind of social justice oriented Catholics who want to see that kind of emphasis, who lean toward Obama, and Catholics who want to see more emphasis on right to life issues that lean more toward Romney. It's a very complex group, and Catholics are also very key groups inside of places like Ohio and the Midwestern states that are Pennsylvania, other places that are very, very important perennially in elections. And the last thing I'll say is still the most ignored important group in the U.S. I think is the white mainline Protestants. They continue to make up 17, 18% of the population. They turn out to vote. They're pretty reliable voters, and they have been moving sort of into the center, but still lean a little bit toward Republican candidates in national presidential elections, but not by a lot. And so, they're still a group that I think is very much up for grabs.
My guest has been Dr. Robert P. Jones, founding CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute. The Institute has just released the 2012 edition of the American Values Survey, and it's full of insights into who our fellow citizens are and what they believe. You can read it at publicreligion.org. Robbie, it's a comprehensive and important piece of work, and I want to thank you not only for doing that work, but for coming and talking with us about it. It's very insightful and very helpful for knowing the kind of world in which we live.
Oh, well, thanks, Walton. Happy to be here.